The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is now in session. L'audience du Tribunal Pénal International pour l'ex-Yougoslavie est ouverte. Please be seated.
Welcome back in the courtroom. Good afternoon to everybody. Could the registrar call the case, please?
Thank you and good afternoon, Your Honours. This is case number ITO 588/2T. The prosecutor was Zdravko Tolimir.
Thank you. I don't believe it's necessary to hear the appearances each day of the whole trial, but as this is the first day of the hearings, I would like to ask counsel for the appearances.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good afternoon, General Tolimir, Mr. Gajic. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nelson Thayer. With me is Senior Trial Attorney Peter McCloskey. We have Janet Stewart, our trial manager, with us today, as she will be with us every day for the remainder of the trial.
Thank you very much. And for the defense?
Thank you, Mr. President. God help you all. God bless you all. My name is Zdravko Tolimir, and this is my legal assistant, Alexander Gajic. I wish you a successful work, and may you bring these proceedings to a successful end, God willing, and I would like to welcome all of you in the courtroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tolimir. I take it that you receive the translation properly? Thank you. I wish everybody for this trial fruitful cooperation and a good atmosphere in the courtroom. We are looking forward to the prosecution to present the opening statement. Mr. Thayer.
Good afternoon again, Your Honors, and may it please the court. Your Honors, on the 12th of May, 1992, at the 16th session of the National Assembly of the Serbian people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, President Radovan Karadzic announced the strategic objectives of the Serbian people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There were 6 of these strategic objectives, and for the people of Srebrenica and Žepa in particular, 2 of these objectives would be carried forth like torches for the rest of the war, keeping the flames of ethnic and religious hatred burning relentlessly, and culminating in the pitiless inferno that ultimately consumed over 7,000 men and boys from Srebrenica on the killing fields of eastern Bosnia, and permanently searing the lives of thousands more of their neighbors and loved ones who survived but were starved, terrorized, shelled, and ultimately driven out of the so-called safe areas of Srebrenica and Žepa in buses, open lorries, dump trucks, literally torn from their loved ones, most of whom they would never see again. The men who carried these torches included the highest level politicians, such as Radovan Karadzic and President of the National Assembly, Momčilo Krajisnik, who set these political strategic objectives, and war goals. And they also included the highest-ranking officers of the Army of Republika Srpska, the VRS, as we will refer to it, such as Ratko Mladic, Milan Gavero, Radislav Kirstic, and the accused, Zdravko Tolimir. Your Honors, these were well-trained officers of the Yugoslav National Army, one of the most professional armies in Eastern Europe at the time. They were graduates of military academies who had received specialized training and attended higher command schools in Belgrade. They were steeped in a tradition of military honor and proud service. And they were also the inheritors of the horrors wrought by the Second World War. The Balkans left as deeply scarred as anywhere in Europe. And to prevent the recurrence of crimes against humanity and violations of international law, the Yugoslav National Army trained these officers in the sacred obligation entrusted to every soldier, and in particular to the proud officer class that would someday lead men in war. That there are rules in war, and that those rules must be obeyed. When the Army of Republika Srpska was formed, it adopted those rules and encoded that sacred obligation, and trained its officers so that genocide and war crimes would never again be the ruinous legacy of men under arms in the lands we now refer to as the former Yugoslavia. This case is about the betrayal of that sacred obligation by one of those officers, Zdravko Tolimir, who served at the highest echelon of the VRS and who was one of Ratko Mladic's most trusted assistant commanders. This case is about General Zdravko Tolimir's choice to forsake his duty to abide by the laws of war in pursuit of a mono-ethnic Serbian state, and ultimately to take part in and lead organized brutality, which he knew violated every tenet of his training and any officer's code, and he well knew were crimes against humanity. General Tolimir sits before you charged with genocide for essentially two reasons, Your Honors. First, because he took part in the unrelenting common plan of the Bosnian Serb military and civilian leadership to expel the Muslim population from the Srebrenica and Žepa enclaves by making their lives so unbearable that they had no hope for survival there. And second, because he assisted, supervised, and authorized the organized detention, execution, and burial of thousands of Muslim men and boys following the elimination by that common plan of the Srebrenica enclave. The prosecution will prove General Tolimir's participation in these heinous events to you through virtually every type of evidence available. Live witness testimony, military records, military intercepts, audio and videotape, forensic science, and aerial imagery. Your Honors, the evidence will show that General Mladic himself told the National Assembly of Republika Srpska in April of 1995, and I quote, "Gentlemen, General Tolimir has been my closest assistant in this war in terms of years of service and has been with me longest from the first days. End of quote. Indeed, General Tolimir was responsible for the units and the men in whom General Mladic placed his very life. And although as main staff assistant commander for intelligence and security, General Tolimir was not a commander in the sense that he could routinely issue orders of a combat nature in the field to fighting units. General Tolimir's authority and influence was indisputable. Prior to the mass deportations and executions in July of 1995, Mladic relied on General Tolimir to help him carry out the slow strangling of the enclaves of Srebrenica and Žepa in order to create those conditions, those inhuman conditions that would later force the Muslim population to give up hope of survival and leave, ultimately in fulfillment of those strategic objectives I spoke about a few moments ago. And when the forced expulsions and mass murder began in July of 1995, the evidence will show that General Tolimir was knee-deep in the middle of it, doing his job with the same combination of big picture, field of vision, and relentless precision that he had always brought to his job, and upon which General Mladic depended. And indeed, I dare say, Your Honors, without which the VRS could not have survived. And the evidence will show that in this misery and carnage in 1995, General Tolimir did issue orders. General Tolimir did make proposals which were implemented. And General Tolimir did oversee and authorize the officers who organized and directed the slaughter of those 7,000 men and boys. It was his men in the main staff, like Lubisha Beata, his direct subordinate, his chief of security, and others all down his professional chain of command line, like Vujadin Popovic from the Drina Corps, who were at the detention and execution and burial sites, Your Honors, making sure that that murder operation did its evil work until the last bullet was fired and the last body buried. This case is not about the farmer soldiers who are pulling the triggers in those killing fields of eastern Bosnia, Your Honors, but about the officer who day in and day out during the war was responsible for the work of the men like Beata and Popovic, who were the ones who made sure that those triggers were getting pulled. And that officer was General Tolimir. Today, I will review with Your Honors some of General Tolimir's specific contributions to both the forcible transfer operation and the murder operation. But as the evidence will show, the horror of July 1995 did not occur spontaneously or in a vacuum. To the contrary, the VRS efforts to remove the Muslim population from Srebrenica and Žepa date back to 1992. And they plot a deliberate course to the ultimate destruction of the Muslim population of Srebrenica and Žepa by that forced expulsion and mass murder. So we need to look at some of the key documents and evidence establishing this crucial context that goes directly to General Tolimir's intent, knowledge, role and contributions to the joint criminal enterprises charged in the indictment. So let us begin by returning to that fateful assembly session in May 1992 and to the strategic objectives of the Serbian people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which were issued by President Karadzic before the assembled. We should have on our screen, Your Honors, a copy of the English translation of the 6 strategic objectives. We note that strategic objective 1, and please let me know if we have any technical difficulties. Strategic objective 1 was to establish state borders separating the Serbian people from the other 2 ethnic communities. And these other 2 ethnic communities, of course, were the Croats and the Muslims. The second objective was to create a corridor that stretched from the northeast to the west. And the third strategic objective, establish a corridor in the Drina River Valley. That is, eliminate the Drina as a border separating the Serbian states. Now, what does this mean? As President Karadzic would say that day, and let's turn to the actual minutes of that assembly. The first such goal, again, is the separation. And he defines the other 2 ethnic communities as those who are our enemies and who have used every opportunity, especially in this century, to attack us, and who would continue with such practices if we were to stay together in the same state. And this refers to the brutal treatment of the Serbs under the Nazi puppet state of the independent state of Croatia during World War II. President Karadzic further defined the third strategic goal. Said that we are on both sides of the Drina, and our strategic interest and our living space are there. We now see a possibility for some Muslim municipalities to be set up along the Drina as enclaves in order for them to achieve their rights, but that belt along the Drina must basically belong to Serbian Bosnia and Herzegovina. As much as it is strategically useful for us in a positive way, it helps us by damaging the interests of our enemy in establishing a corridor which would connect them to the Muslim International and render this area permanently unstable. So here we have the deadly combination. The desire to unite with Mother Serbia across the river, to form a united Serbian state, paired with the fear that your enemy will come commit genocide against you. And you will see time and again, Your Honors, this drumbeat of impending genocide at the hands of the Muslims and Croats in the documents and from the mouths of the main staff. Now, another important development at this 16th Assembly session is the establishment of the Army itself. First named the Army of the Serbian Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then soon known as the Army of Republika Srpska, or VRS. And on that day as well, Ratko Mladic was appointed commander of the Army's main staff. The evidence will show that General Tolimir, then a colonel, was in Banja Luka for this assembly session, and he himself would address countless other sessions during the war. And you will see that as General Mladic accepted the appointment as commander of the main staff, even then, he took the opportunity to refer to General Tolimir by name during his address to the Assembly that day. And you will hear that the day before, on 11 May 1992, 12 JNA officers, 4 of whom were generals, General Mladic, General Manjolo Milovanovic, who you will hear about, General Milan Guerrero, who you will hear about, and General George Jukic, who you will hear a little bit about, met near Han Piesak at Cerna Rijeka, where the army would be headquartered. And they were informed that Mladic, the following day, would establish that the army would be established the following day, and Mladic would be appointed the commander of the main staff. They were told the day before the assembly that Guerrero would be the assistant commander for moral guidance, Jukic its assistant commander for logistics, and Colonel Tolimir the assistant commander for intelligence and security. And here we see the lineup, as it were, pretty much from the beginning, from the very first day. Mladic, Guerrero, Tolimir. And you'll see all the official presidential orders putting these assignments into effect, creating the corps, calling up every member of Serbian nationality to join the VRS and bring with them their JNA equipment and weapons, and critically assigning its most capable officers to the most important positions in the army. And the way it worked was Radovan Karadzic became the supreme commander of the armed forces, which consisted of the VRS, the police, also known or referred to as the MOOP, Ministry of Interior, MOOP, and the civilian defense. And as commander of the main staff, Mladic was directly subordinated to President Karadzic. Now, how do we know that these strategic objectives announced in May 1992 were more than just words of politicians and were in fact being communicated to the soldiers in the field? The first thing I want to tell you about is a meeting that occurred in Bijeljina on the 2nd of September 1992, attended by President Karadzic, Assembly President Krajisnik, and General Guerrero, representing the main staff. You will see the war diary of now General Novica Simic, who was the commander of the East Bosnia Corps during the war. You will hear that Momcilo Krajisnik addressed the gathering and reiterated the 6 strategic objectives, all 6 of which General Simic faithfully recorded in his diary at the time. And he noted, for our purposes, the first strategic objective was separation from the Muslims, and then the Drina Valley to the Serbs. So you see the gospel going out. It's been out there for a while, but it's going out in full strength during this time. And how do we know that that is then getting transformed into military action? From rhetoric, from the assembly floor, to concrete results on the ground. And importantly for our purposes, how are these relevant to the case against General Tolimir? The evidence will show that these war goals were communicated and translated into concrete military tasks by way of documents called directives. These were written documents which assigned the VRS forces specific military operations for a specific geographic zone and a specific time period, usually divided into stages with specific durations and set objectives. And as we will examine later, these directives were typically drafted in the main staff by a process in which Mladic's assistant commanders, like General Tolimir, provided their expert input regarding the directive's larger goals and missions, and after which they were synthesized and shaped into a militarily cohesive document that could be understood and implemented by the operational level of the Army, that is, by the corps and on down. They were approved by President Karadzic, signed by him in some cases, signed by General Mladic or General Milovanovic and others before being distributed down the command chain. And then the lower level commands would receive those documents, analyze them, and turn them into concrete missions on the ground. And that is how the strategic war goals and aims are funneled down. And let's look at one of the key documents, Directive 4, as it will be referred to during the trial. You can see that it begins with the review of the current military and political situation and the enemy's activities and intentions. And in the main staff, it was General Tolimir's job to find out what the enemy's activities and intentions were, so that the VRS could make the best informed assessments and warfighting decisions. That was part of his job. And as we move through the document, we see that it reflects that the Drina Corps, the corps that encompassed the enclaves of Srebrenica, Žepa, Gorazda, had recently been formed and was in the process of active combat activities in the area known as the Podrinje, or Podrinje, which encompassed these areas as well. The directive further notes that the enemy groups in Gorazda, Žepa, and Srebrenica, and Cerska have not been totally routed. And okay, so far what we see is the normal war-fighting language, nothing wrong with this. Defeat the enemy, inflict the heaviest losses possible. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, the Drina Corps from its present positions shall exhaust the enemy, inflict the heaviest possible losses. But then we see this language, and I quote, "and force him to leave the Birac, Žepa, and Gorazda areas together with the Muslim population." You'll hear that the Birac area encompassed Srebrenica and Zvornik and some other areas along a little belt. Your Honors, this is an illegal order. You could almost miss it being one line of text, but there it is. And we will soon see that they're not just words on paper. In a well-organized and disciplined army like the VRS, this order represented the considered intent of the Bosnian Serbs' highest military and political command: force the Muslims out. Now, General Milovanovic, who wrote this, will testify as a prosecution witness, and to no one's great surprise, he will probably be less than candid about the meaning of this order. But we will see exactly what it meant. Just a couple of days later, we have here a Drina Corps order dated 24 November 1992. It's issued by then Colonel Jovanovic. You will hear about him throughout the trial. In July of 1995, he was General Jovanovic, commander of the Drina Corps until 13 July, when General Kirstich took over. But in 1992, he is in full command of the Drina Corps. And what does he say in this order? You'll see at the very top of the first paragraph, pursuant to the directive of the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska, and he cites the specific order number of Directive 4, so there's no doubt what he's talking about. I have decided to launch an attack. But again, we see the language, this key language. And I quote, "and force the Muslim local population to abandon the area of Serska, Žepa, Srebrenica, and Gorazda." The meaning of General Milovanovic's words were obviously not lost on General Jovanovic. And we'll see further in the order, when he talks about the moral and psychological preparations, how important to the VRS this operation was from a strategic point of view. Inform the unit members about the important aim of that operation and underlined that the outcome of minor actions and of the whole operation is of crucial importance for the realization of the aim of the Serbian people, namely the creation and establishment of a Serbian state in these areas. Now let's take a look for a moment, Your Honors, at some maps. You've heard references to the Drina Corps and various other locations in eastern Bosnia. Birac, again, that's the area of Bratunac, Vlasenica, Zvornik, Srebrenica, and Serska. And you will hear references to the Podrinje, the upper Podrinje, the lower Podrinje, middle Podrinje. But let's just take a look at the basics right now. You can see on the left, in blue, the Drina River flowing northwards as it does on the eastern border of the Drina Corps, all the way up beyond Bijeljina, and ultimately it empties out into another river. But you'll see that it passes very close to Žepa at the bottom there, and that will figure later in the trial. Muslim men fleeing for their lives will swim across that river. And we see that the Drina Corps was headquartered in Vlasenica. And just to the north, you can see the East Bosnia Corps, which was, as I mentioned, commanded by General Simic, the fellow who wrote down the 6 strategic objectives in his war diary that we heard about a moment ago. Turning to this second map, again, you can see the border of the Drina River in blue and exactly how close it does flow to Žepa. And you can see the 3 enclaves starting from the southwest up to the northeast, Gorazde, Žepa, and Srebrenica. And you can see how close Srebrenica and Žepa really are. And pretty much smack in the middle of the map, there's a blue flag, and that represents the main staff command post at Crna Rijeka, just a little bit to the southeast of Han Pijesak. And I won't go through all the brigades with you, but a couple of the key ones. You see just below Žepa, to the southwest, the 1st Podrinje Light Infantry Brigade. That is more commonly known as the Rogatica Brigade because it was based in the town of Rogatica, commanded by Rajko Kusic. And north of Srebrenica, you will see the 1st Zvornik Brigade. That was commanded by Vinko Pandurovic in July of 1995. Now, Your Honors, immediately following the issuance of Directive 4, you will hear that the Drina Corps was not able successfully to carry out all of the tasks given it. Specifically, you'll hear that Muslim forces gained many military successes in late 1992 and early into 1993, including the assault on Orthodox Christmas of the village of Kravica on the 7th of January, 1993. That assault was conducted by forces led by Nasser Oric, who you will hear about. Naturally, you will see that General Tolimir was familiar with these events at the time as they represented a significant military defeat and also serious threats, obviously, to the area's security. It was his job to know what the enemy was up to, and perhaps more importantly, what it was likely to be up to. So here we just have an example. You'll note at the top it says main staff of the VRS, Intelligence and Security Administration. That was General Tolimir's outfit in the main staff. It would later become known as a sector, so you'll see documents with Intelligence and Security Sector. That's how you know we're talking about the main staff when you hear the word sector. He's passing this information on, that he's received information that the Muslims are planning to repeat the attack in 2 or 3 days. He's keeping his eye on this area. And what we see happening is a Drina Corps counterattack. What we have on the screen now is a Drina Corps combat order for the liberation of Kamenica Serska Konjevic Polje. A series of towns, and we'll take a look at a map in a few moments, roughly to the west of Srebrenica. We can see from the first paragraph here that General Jovanovic refers back to his November 1992 order, in which he explicitly incorporated the language from Directive 4, that criminal order to remove the Muslim population, to force them out. We see he refers to that order. You can see he refers to the serious losses on our forces in Kravica, Glogova, another village nearby. And then he orders the liberation Again, under morale and psychological preparations, we see how important, how strategically important this area was to the Bosnian Serbs. It should be stressed, and I quote, that the success of these activities is hugely important for the Serbian people of this area and beyond. Now, what followed, Your Honors, in carrying out General Jovanović's order was the forced expulsion of the civilian populations from these areas of Kamenica, Serska, and Konjević Polje. You will hear testimony about the Drina Corps' brutal attacks on these locations, the relentless shelling and targeting of civilians that forced the Muslim population out of their homes, steadily eastwards towards Srebrenica. As village after village fell to the Serb shelling, as they burned the houses in their wake, or to use the term the VRS like to use as a euphemism, liberated. When you see that term, liberated, the evidence will show that means ethnically cleansed, forcibly expelled. Just very quickly, here's a map showing you these areas I'm talking about. You can see Zvornik. Just to the south of Zvornik is the area of Kamenica. Here we've highlighted an area called Chanchari, which is nearby. And these villages, one by one, Serska, Konjević Polje, fell, and the populations were driven into Srebrenica. This is a huge swath of territory. You will hear testimony from people that survived these attacks. And you will hear testimony about the humanitarian disaster that was created by having all of these tens of thousands of people compressed into the town of Srebrenica. And if we could take a moment and play just a little bit of video for a couple of minutes to give you an idea of what these conditions were like. And then I want to talk a little bit more about how this is relevant to General Tolimir, his state of mind, his knowledge, the charges in this case.
In trying to do what it thinks is best for the people of Srebrenica, the UN has spent more time planning, waiting around, being turned back and thwarted constantly.
The interpreters note that they don't have the transcript of this clip and cannot interpret it into BCS.
Should be reduced, particularly those who are already refugees, the thousands who have no real accommodation or support in the town. And on this basis, the High Commissioner for Refugees Special Envoy denies being involved with the policy of ethnic cleansing.
The people we are evacuating from Srebrenica have already been ethnically cleansed because they are coming from areas that have already fallen under Serbian control. They are not people from Srebrenica, they are refugees that arrived
from the villages around.
Villages around, and also from Konjević Polje, from Serska, areas that fall under Serbian control a couple of weeks ago.
However, Mr. Mendelucci's plan today is ambitious. For over a week, large convoys similar to the 20-truck ones he's now proposing have at times been delayed or refused passage by a single individual military official at a routine checkpoint. The situation is being both intensified and muddled by more fighting. Though the ceasefire is holding up relatively well in most of Bosnia, there is heavy fighting around Srebrenica, with the Serbs shelling south of the town and the Muslims fighting back hard. Also, there is no firm commitment on the ground to the UN's evacuation plans. They are ambitious, and there is considerable doubt here that all will go smoothly. Kate Adey, BBC News, Bosnia.
In eastern Bosnia, 37 wounded Muslims have been airlifted from the besieged Muslim enclave of Žepa. The helicopters from the United Nations Protection Force are the first allowed into the area since Žepa was designated a safe area by the UN Security Council at the weekend. Many thousands who fled into the mountains around Žepa are thought to be making their way to Gorazde, another Muslim enclave declared a safe zone by the UN. The Muslims airlifted were taken to Zenica in central Bosnia.
The airlift was thrown behind schedule by Serb objections and because the casualties were too frightened to leave their hiding places in the woods and hills around Žepa. The first helicopters carried 22 seriously wounded people to the safe Muslim town of Zenica. Some of the amputees slowly struggled across the landing strip. In Žepa, they were sitting targets. Now they have a chance to live normally.
Excuse me, Mr. Thayer, you realized that there was no interpretation into BCS?
Yes, Your Honor. Frankly, the audio is not important for the purposes of the videos. This idea was to give the trial chamber a sense of the crowded conditions in Srebrenica and just a visual on the wounded coming out of the Žepa enclave. We do not have, unfortunately, a transcript prepared for the video in either English or BCS at this point.
But you should be aware of this problem.
Yes, I understand, Your Honor. We have translations for everything else that we've got prepared for the presentation.
Please carry on.
Thank you. Now, Your Honors, I'm going to move through some reports concerning these activities, save a little bit of time for us, and move directly to what I was mentioning a moment ago, the evidence tying the main staff and General Tolimir to these events in 1993. What we have on the screen is a main staff analysis of its combat readiness for the year 1992. What these combat readiness analyses were basically a self-evaluation conducted first at the lower command echelons and then ultimately by the main staff. It was pretty much a report card to itself on how it had performed in the previous year. So here we have one prepared in April of 1993 for 1992. These combat readiness analyses were preceded by a 2 or 3 day conference attended by Mladic and his assistant commanders, corps commanders, and the highest level political authorities in the RS. And they presented and discussed all of their respective combat readiness analysis elements, their achievements, their problems, and the future tasks. We see here General Tolimir was responsible for addressing this seminar. And we have here an idea of how the main staff viewed itself and the relationship between the strategic objectives and the directives. You can see it refers to the need to ward off Muslim Croat forces and protect the Serbian people from extermination and genocide, while at the same time laying the foundations of the Serbian state. And then it gets specific. These strategic objectives were defined before the main staff, and they served as a general guideline upon which the main staff planned its actual operations and concerted battles. And basically what they're saying here is that they had more broad objectives set before them by the politicians, but then, to use their words, as you can see in this excerpt, and I quote, "The main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska translated the set objectives and tasks into general and individual missions of the VRS."
You don't have anything on the screen?
Ja se izvinjavam.
My apologies. I am only being shown documents in English. And as the gentleman is presenting these documents, he's not citing their 65 turn numbers, so I'm unable to locate them at a later stage either. And what I have here is in English only. Thank you for allowing me to say this, and I apologize for interrupting.
Mr. Tolimir, we are not in the phase of receiving evidence, but in the opening statement. You can raise that problem later. Thank you. Carry on.
Thank you, Mr. President. We can see that, again, the document itself, written by the main staff, notes that they're defending the Serbian people against genocide, protecting the property and cultural heritage of the Serbian people, and then focusing on the liberation of territories which are ours and which belong to us by historical birthright. So more importantly, for our specific purposes, what does this document have to say about the Army's focus on this area in the Proginier? And we see that they recognize the success that they've had on the liberation, again to use their euphemism, of the Proginier. And they're referring to the specific strategic objective of our war being realized, one that could be defined as establishing contact with Serbia on the Drina River, or the Drina ceasing to be a frontier. That's strategic objective 3. And again, by taking Kamenica, Serska, Glogova, the VRS recognizes that it will shortly have achieved the strategic task. They haven't achieved it yet because they haven't taken Srebrenica. And finally, it refers to the presence of the commander of the main staff or of a representative of the main staff in the units carrying out the mission for this liberation as a specific way of giving weight to and steering combat operation towards a single goal. And what the evidence will show in this case, Your Honors, is that this was the preferred practice of the main staff. To place one of General Mladic's most trusted assistants forward to where the main effort was, where the battle was at hand, so that they could steer and guide the action, if need be, to ensure that General Mladic's intent was being carried out on the ground. I want to show you a report of a meeting that was held on the 12th of April, 1993. This meeting was attended by the UN Force Commander, by General Morion, who you've heard about already, Mr. Mendeluce. He was the gentleman in the video you saw who was describing the cleansing from Srpska. And it was attended by General Mladic, Guerrero, and Tolimir. General Mladic states that he was attending the meeting for the Muslim civilian population in Srebrenica and not for his own people. We see the document says that Mladic said that he had been aware of the fact that the presidency delegation would not attend the meeting because this was part of the Muslim strategy to present the situation as badly as possible. Mladic went on to say that the complete truth was that Srebrenica was not attacked and that it was completely quiet in the area, and that only the BIH, you'll see the Muslim army referred to as the ABIH, the Armia of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Only the BIH has broken the ceasefire. He said that the civilians were not a target of the VRS. Here it's referred to as the Serbian Republic Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the old name. He says the Serbs have no problems with the evacuation of the civilians. Their actions were only of a defensive character, and that he accused the Muslims of abusing the humanitarian aid convoys for propaganda and to achieve their goals. You will see throughout the trial, Your Honors, that this is a consistent strategy employed by the senior members of the main staff, be it Mladic, Guerrero, or Tolimir. Admit nothing, deny everything, make counter allegations, and lie. Now, there's nothing wrong with deceiving the enemy. There's nothing wrong with lying to your enemy's face. That's war. But when you do it to help further a criminal objective, like forcing the civilian population from their homes because they are Muslims, and therefore an obstacle to your plan to have a Serbian state, that's a contribution to a joint criminal enterprise. And you will see General Tolimir do this while the VRS is shelling UNPROFOR positions and the hospital in downtown Srebrenica in July of 1995. And you'll see at the bottom of this excerpt, Mr. Thornbury asked if the Serbs would take Srebrenica by force. And General Mladic responded that he would try to solve the Srebrenica problem in a political way. And he added that Srebrenica was not part of Eastern Bosnia, but that it was in fact a part of Republika Srpska. Now, one notorious incident you will hear about, Your Honors, occurred on this very day, April 12, 1993. Serb shelling struck a playground in Srebrenica and killed approximately 60 people, many of whom were youngsters. You will see the UN respond to that. You will hear witnesses who were present. And we will see time and again the main staff saying one thing and then doing another. And the main staff was, of course, well aware of what was happening in Srebrenica during this period in 1993, just as it would be well aware and part of what was going on in 1995. Here we have a request from the Drina Corps Command, again, then Colonel Jovanovic, to the main staff, the day after those 60 people were killed by shelling. He starts off by saying, "You are well aware that a large number of civilians from Srebrenica and other locations have found refuge in Srebrenica." And then he goes on to talk about the population that's caught, encircled by the Serb forces. And he's writing this to General Guerrero, the morale assistant commander. And he asks Guerrero for the main staff's help. And they should engage themselves with projecting information to the Muslims of Srebrenica on the means of their safe evacuation from the combat zone. Liberation, safe evacuation. Again, this is an example of the grotesque euphemisms that you're going to hear used in these VRS documents. And it's particularly sardonic when placed in the context of its Colonel Jovanovich's troops, which are dropping those shells on the playground, and that had just conducted this ethnic cleansing campaign that brought everybody, all those civilians, into Srebrenica in the first place. And we'll see that just a couple of days later, the UN declared Srebrenica a safe area, citing what it termed this abhorrent campaign of ethnic cleansing. And of course, General Tolimir is aware of this situation because it's his job to know. He's got to know what's happening down there. And we see him sending out an intelligence report just a couple of days later, after the massacre at the playground. This goes to President Karadzic, all of the intelligence and security organs, security departments. It goes across the river to Serbia, to the Yugoslav army, the VJ. He mentions General Morion's involvement, and then he writes, "Their propaganda campaign aimed at internationalizing the problem and securing the deployment of UNPROFOR in Srebrenica churns out allegations of artillery fire targeting the town and causing numerous casualties among civilians." So by Tolimir's turn of phrase, those 60 lives become simply propaganda and mere allegations. And Your Honors, this is evidence, and you will see it time and again, of how General Tolimir shapes and steers the message that goes out to the army and that facilitates the continuation of these tactics by the VRS. We're not doing anything wrong. It's all Muslim propaganda. We're not doing anything wrong. The Muslims are shelling themselves. And they're blaming it on us. So that begs the question, why does the Chief of Intelligence and Security for the main staff write this stuff? And it may sound delusional, but as you will see, Your Honors, in part owing to the horrendous atrocities suffered by the Serbs during the Second World War, General Tolimir and the main staff shared with the Bosnian Serb political leadership the self-perception that the West and the Arab nation and world and Catholic forces were all ranged against the Serbs. That genocide was just around the corner, and the only way to prevent that genocide was to remove the Croats and the Muslims. Did General Tolimir really believe it? I don't know. But you will see over and over again General Tolimir denying what the world knew to be the case, repeating the mantra. I think it's called owning the message. VRS shells weren't killing civilians in Srebrenica. People weren't starving and suffering because of any VRS ethnic cleansing campaign. And whether he believed the message or not is not as important as the fact that, again, he is shaping the message. He and Guevara, the chief propagandist, are selling the message to their men in the trenches. Here we have another example, 17 April, May 1993, another intelligence report. The Muslims are manipulating the wounded and attributing offensive operations to the VRS. A few days later, he refers to a propaganda campaign about Jepa and Gorazda, where people are allegedly dying of hunger, as they did about Srebrenica. Now, despite the international condemnation expressed in UN Security Resolution 819 declaring Srebrenica a safe area, and perhaps even spurred by it, the VRS launches an operation in May of 1993, and we see here a main staff combat order for the liberation of Jepa and Gorazda. This was drafted in the main staff. And there's the usual preamble, the political situation, the intentions of the enemy. From the document, we can see that what the VRS is afraid of is UN peacekeepers on the ground in Jepa, preventing them from taking over Jepa, as they were prevented from ultimately taking Srebrenica. This combat order, and I quote from an operative section in the beginning. The Muslim leadership is trying to internationalize the problem of the Prodinje region at any cost by bringing the UN forces to Srebrenica, Jepa, and Gorazda, and organizing other humanitarian actions. And again, what this is expressing is we've got to get the Muslims out before the UN gets here. And if this language about internationalizing the problem sounds familiar, it's because we just saw it a couple of minutes ago in General Tolimir's intelligence report. So you see his influence here. They are contributing to this overall effort to remove the Muslims from eastern Bosnia. And if we move through the document, you'll see they talk about fully mopping up various areas of the Drina River Valley. And then, significantly, it says in the middle, and I quote, to enable the Muslim civilian population to move out, in parentheses, this is their language, transfer, to other territories, or to recognize the rule of Republika Srpska, and in that manner create conditions for the return of the Serbian population to the left and right bank of the Drina River. Once again, we have here in order to achieve strategic objective 1, separate out the Muslims, and strategic objective 3, the elimination of the Drina River as a barrier to a unitary Serbian state. And here we have references to an organized exit of the civilian population. And you'll note, please, at the top of the document, a reference to a sabotage detachment and the 65th Protection Regiment. These are main staff assets, and you will see how these main staff units are employed during the Srebrenica operation and in the murder operation. So here we have organized exit, enabling the transfer, just like General Jovanovich's safe evacuation, all euphemisms for move them out, euphemisms for expulsion. And this reference to staying and putting oneself under RS authority. As you will see from, for example, the report that I moved through, from the other evidence that we will show you, after what the VRS did during this campaign, the main staff knows that no Muslim in his or her right mind would choose to stay. And there's no way the VRS would have let them. And one indicia of what their stay would have been like is evidenced by the destruction of mosque after mosque after mosque. And you'll see that repeated again in 1995. You'll see lip service in VRS documents paid to this idea that we'll let the Muslims stay if they recognize our authority. We'll treat them according to the Geneva Conventions. And then as soon as the UN leaves, the mosques get blown up. Pure lip service, window dressing, and nothing more. Now you'll see that this combat order actually led to an attack on Jepa in 1993 that went on until the UN passed another resolution declaring Jepa and Gorazda and Sarajevo and Bihać all safe areas. And Mr. Butler, the prosecution's military expert, will probably also show you yet another combat order directed at Gorazda. And remember, there are three eastern enclaves we're talking about: Gorazda, Jepa, and Srebrenica. Obviously, we're focused on Srebrenica and Jepa. Those are the events from 1995 that are of greatest interest. And you'll see reports, Your Honors, during this time when Jepa is being shelled, from General Tolimir again to President Karadzic, describing the attacks as propaganda, referring to them as alleged, when no one can deny the activity on the ground. Here we see he's accusing and alleging that there is systematic misinforming, alleged fierce attacks by the VRS. You just saw the combat order ordering attacks. And we saw that the UN had to intervene to stop those attacks. And in this document from 3 May of 1993, another intelligence report, again referring to these reports of the attacks and shelling and misery as a propaganda campaign. Quote, they make much of dying of hunger, lack of medicines, and make appeals to the conscience of international institutions. General Tolimir wrote this just a day before the UN declared Jebba a safe area, and just days before those wounded were brought out on the helicopters that you saw in the video. Little girl, old men and women, victims of shelling and sniping. And why is this all relevant to this case? It's relevant, Your Honors, because it is compelling evidence of General Tolimir's state of mind and his shared intent with the architects and the engineers of this widespread suffering and forced expulsion. And what the evidence will show is that in the beginning of March 1995, with the end of the war in sight, the Bosnian Serb political and military leadership decided on a plan to bring the issue of the enclaves to an end once and for all, to bring it to a boiling point, and recreate this humanitarian disaster from 1993. And it is important to have an understanding, Your Honors, of just how intimately General Tolimir knew these enclaves and understood their strategic importance to the Bosnian Serb military and political leadership he was a key part of. So that by the time 1995 comes, he's going to be engaging in the same activities, the same practices. What I'd like to do now, Your Honors, is turn to a brief overview of the prosecution's evidence of the main staff and how it operated and was constructed, the duties and responsibilities of the accused, how his sector worked, and so forth. Your Honors, as the highest echelon in the VRS, it was the main staff where the military activities of the Army were harmonized with the political war goals and the diplomatic efforts undertaken by the Bosnian Serb government leadership. It was the main staff that interacted with this high level, with President Karadzic, with Mr. Krajisnik, and the Assembly. And it was exclusively main staff officers like General Tolimir, like General Guerrero, and occasionally Mladic himself, who would address the National Assembly. He would provide an overall assessment of the military political situation, as well as the picture on the ground. He knew the facts, the figures of the entire war theater when he addressed the National Assembly. They would advocate on behalf of the Army on any number of issues, ranging from funding to specific military decisions that they made in a particular municipality. And it also meant that General Tolimir and a select group of main staff officers would meet regularly with President Karadzic, talk to him on the phone, You'll see evidence from President Karadzic's agenda showing these meetings in Pale at the presidency. And indeed, you will hear Generals Mladic and Tolimir both speak themselves about how often the main staff reported its activities to President Karadzic, consulted with him several times a day. So let's take a look at the structure of the main staff. You should have a chart in front of you. We've tried to make it as simple as possible, although that's never really attainable. At the top, we see General Mladic. Again, we know that he was the commander of the main staff, subordinate only to President Karadzic. Directly below him was his chief of staff, Manolo Milovanovic. Now, he simultaneously, with his chief of staff position, held the position of deputy commander if Mladic were absent. And as a first among equals among the high command in the army, General Milovanovic alone had the right to issue combat orders on his own. General Milovanovic you could describe as being Mladic's main warfighting man and was subsequently placed forward in various parts of the war theater for weeks or even months at a time. And you'll see that in July of 1995, General Milovanovic is out of the picture in the far west of the country. Now, General Milovanovic was also responsible as Chief of Staff for the main staff's staff sector. And one might describe that as the nerve center of the main staff. You can see it here on the chart to the left. The heart of the main staff, in many respects, is operations. And Radivoje Militic was the chief of operations and training, chief of that administration. His main duties and responsibilities were to follow the developments across the war theater, analyze all the reports that were flowing in from the corps, put those together, send a report up to President Karadzic describing what was going on every day, but also to separate out developments which were important for each of the other assistant commanders to know about. The operations branch also translated General Mladic's intentions into actual combat documents. They're the guys that sit down and actually draft a lot of the combat documents that get distributed on behalf of the main staff. And within General Militic's administration, you will see the head of the operations department, then Colonel Lyubo Obradovic, who was the assistant chief of the section for operations affairs. And you will hear from him. He will come and testify. And Colonel Obradovic's section was, in many ways, really where a lot of the work was done in terms of the analysis of all this information, the nerve center. And because the Ops and Training Administration was responsible for following these developments, developments, they had to acquire, obtain information from all different sources. As I said, the core reports, the regular reporting every day that was coming in, reports from the individual assistant commanders, oral reports from the corps commanders, information from General Tolimir's intelligence and security sector. And as we'll see in a little while, good communications and constant regular reporting were critical for the main staff, both in its operations center and up and down the professional lines of command. And we'll see in July of 1995, because General Milovanovic was away, you'll see a lot of documents with General Militich's name on it as standing in for General Milovanovic. And you'll also see, while we're looking at this staff sector, there was a chief of training, chief of the training department, and that name, I think, pretty much speaks for itself. Now, in addition to the chief of staff in the staff sector, General Mladic also had his assistant commanders, each of whom headed a separate branch. And I see we're nearing what I think is probably the break time, Mr. President. I can stop here for a moment and pick up, or I can continue for a couple more minutes, as you wish.
Have you an estimation how many minutes you need for finishing this part?
I will need probably more time than the translators would like to do their jobs, Mr. President.
We must have our first break now. On technical reasons, we need a break, and we resume 4:15.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.